The Library of Vanished Souls. Chapter 1. Whispers Between the Shelves. The library stood at the edge of the forgotten part of town, its stone walls cracked with age and covered in ivy-like veins of time itself. Inside, the scent of old paper and lost time lingered in the air. Dust motes danced in the shafts of light streaming through stained glass windows, casting ghostly patterns on the floor. It was here, in this quiet realm of forgotten knowledge, that 12-year-old Elara first heard them. The whisper. At first, she thought it was the rustling of the pages or the wind slipping through ancient cracks. But as she wandered deeper into the library, the voices grew more distinct. They spoke in hushed tones, some in languages she didn't recognize, others murmuring names, dates, and secrets. No one else seemed to notice. The librarian smiled politely when Elara asked, but there was a flicker of unease behind his eyes. Drawn by the voices, Elara found herself standing before a section of books that didn't exist on the map. Aisles that curved strangely, with no end in sight. A book slid from the shelf on its own and landed at her feet. Its cover was blank, but when she opened it, the pages were filled with writing in glowing ink. Words that shifted and changed as if they were alive. Her fingers trembled as she turned the pages, the voices growing louder with each one. They weren't just whispers, they were memories, lost thoughts, echoes of souls who had once passed through the library and never left. Elara didn't know it yet, but she had been chosen. The library had noticed her. That night, Elara couldn't sleep. She lay awake, haunted by the glow of the ink and the sound of the voices that still echoed in her head. In her dreams, the library stretched endlessly, its shelves bending and twisting into impossible shapes. She saw shadows of people, translucent and flickering, reaching for books they could never grasp. When she woke, she was clutching the book she had found, though she was certain she had left it behind. Over the following days, she returned to the same section, hoping to understand what she had experienced. The same book was always waiting, its pages different each time. One day it showed a story from centuries ago, of a girl not unlike herself, who had vanished inside the library. Another time, the book showed her a reflection of her own face, but older, worn, and with eyes that had seen too much. The librarian grew more distant, watching her from behind his desk with an expression that was no longer friendly. One evening, when the library was empty, he approached her quietly and placed a finger to his lips. "If the voices ask you to follow," he whispered, "don't." Then he walked away, leaving her with more questions than answers. But Elara was too curious. The next time the whispers called her name, she didn't hesitate. The shelves parted, revealing a hidden corridor she had never seen before. As she stepped into it, the air grew colder, heavier, as if the library itself were holding its breath. Elara knew she was crossing a threshold, but into what she didn't yet understand. And the whispers, they were only the beginning. Chapter 2. The Girl Who Heard the Silence. Silence had always followed Elara, like a shadow she could never shake. Even before the library chose her, she was the quiet one in every classroom, the child who preferred books to people, imagination to noise. But after the whispers began, silence became something else entirely. Alive, deliberate, filled with meaning she couldn't quite grasp. A week had passed since she first stepped into the hidden corridor. Since then, she hadn't told anyone, not her parents, not her teachers. The world outside the library felt dull and distant, as if her senses only sharpened when surrounded by the musty breath of the old building and its watching shelves. On a rainy afternoon, Elara returned. The storm outside clattered against the stained glass windows, but inside it was eerily still. The librarian was absent for once, or perhaps hiding, though she felt his presence linger. She found herself drawn again to the strange corridor that appeared only when the library was empty enough to breathe. This time, it didn't just open for her, it seemed to expect her. The shelves slid apart slowly, almost reverently. As she stepped into the hallway, the whispers stopped. Every sound vanished, not muffled, not faded, gone. No footsteps echoed. Her breathing felt like a scream. The silence was so intense, it pressed against her eardrums. Panic prickled her skin. But then she heard it, a hum beneath the silence. Not sound exactly, but something else, a presence, a message. As she moved forward, the corridor curved and narrowed, leading to a small room lined with mirrors. Each mirror reflected something different. One showed her standing still, another showed her older, cloaked in shadows. One didn't reflect her at all, but the largest mirror showed her standing in a library, drenched in firelight, holding a glowing book. Elara approached that one. Her reflection looked back at her and then blinked. "Do you hear it now?" her reflection whispered. Elara staggered back. Her real lips hadn't moved. The room was still silent. The reflection moved on its own, lips parting to speak again. "The silence isn't empty," it said. "It's full of them." "Full of who?" Elara asked, her own voice sounding foreign to her ears. "The ones no one listened to," the reflection answered. "The forgotten, the trapped, the ones who vanished without a word." Elara stared at the mirror, at herself, and at the sorrow in the eyes of the girl within. Her hands were trembling. Suddenly a cracking sound echoed across the silence, not from her, but from the mirror. A jagged line split across the surface, and the reflection screamed. Elara turned to run, but the door was gone. The room was shifting, the silence pulsing now, like a heartbeat. On the walls, the mirrors began to speak. Voices layered over each other in a language not meant for the living. I didn't mean to disappear. I only wanted someone to hear me. Please, remember me." And then came the loudest silence of all, one that filled her with a pain so ancient it felt like it was not hers alone. Suddenly, Elara was outside the corridor again, standing in the regular part of the library. She gasped for air, heart pounding, body cold with sweat. The corridor was gone, no trace, no mirrors, no voices. But something had followed her out. In her hand was a shard of mirror, smooth, silver, humming faintly, and etched into its surface were words she hadn't seen before. "The ones who hear the silence must speak for those who can't." And now Elara was beginning to understand. She hadn't just been chosen to listen. She had been chosen to remember. Chapter 3: The Key Made of Memories. The storm outside had passed, leaving the town drenched and the library glowing faintly in the after-rain mist. Elara returned with the mirror shard tucked safely in her coat pocket, its words still humming against her side. She walked with purpose now, a girl unraveling a mystery older than her own name. The whispers had returned, quieter, more hesitant, but they still followed her between the shelves. Today, she found herself in a new wing of the library. The architecture was different, less grand, more intimate. The ceiling was lower, the wood darker, the air smelled different too, like lavender, soot, and something like old tears. She noticed a desk in the far corner, barely visible beneath layers of forgotten paper. Drawers hung slightly open, and something about it tugged at her memory, as though she had seen it before in a dream. Compelled, Elara crossed the room and pulled open the top drawer. Dust spiraled into the air, catching the light. Inside lay stacks of yellowing cards, brittle and crumbling at the edges. Most were blank, but at the very bottom she found a small velvet pouch. It was old, embroidered with silver thread, and as she picked it up, a soft chiming sound echoed faintly around the room, though no bells could be seen. Inside the pouch was a key. It was unlike any she had ever seen, carved from crystal and brass, delicate yet heavy, and etched with symbols that shimmered when she tilted it. As she held it, images burst into her mind, fleeting, like dreams remembered just before waking. A woman in mourning, a child hiding beneath a desk, a man screaming into a void. None of them were familiar, but all of them felt heartbreakingly real. Suddenly, the drawer slammed shut behind her. She jumped and turned, but the room was empty. "Elara," a voice whispered from nowhere. "The key remembers." She clutched it tightly and looked around. One of the bookcases had shifted slightly. Between the shelves, a thin line of light appeared, like a doorway cracking open. As she approached, the light grew brighter, pulling her toward it. The key grew warm in her hand. The crack widened into an arched door made entirely of wood and glass, covered in symbols she recognized from the key. She inserted it slowly. The lock clicked, but not like a mechanical sound. It was softer, almost like a breath held and then released. Beyond the door was a chamber, round and glowing with memory. The walls were lined with jars of light, memories suspended in time. Each one shimmered and pulsed with scenes inside them. People laughing, crying, embracing, vanishing. It was beautiful and heartbreaking. She walked among them until one jar began to tremble. She reached out and touched it, and the memory spilled into her mind. A boy, no older than 7, hiding behind a library curtain as his parents argued. He had cried silently, clutching a paper bird. And then, darkness. The boy had never left. Elara fell to her knees. The weight of the memory was too much. She looked at the key in her hand and understood. It wasn't just a key. It was a beacon, a vessel, a collector of lost moments. And now it was hers. Behind her, the door began to close, but not before she stepped out and turned back to see it seal itself back into the wall, vanishing entirely. In her hand, the key still shimmered, but now it felt heavier because it no longer just carried memories. It carried a promise. Chapter 4, Room 13, The Door That Knows Your Name. There were many rooms in the library that Elara had never seen before, but none were talked about with such fearful reverence as Room 13. It was said to be locked, not with a key, but with silence itself. A place sealed by the weight of names that were spoken only once, and then forgotten. She had heard the whispers mention it before. 13. Not yet ready. The girl must choose. It didn't make sense, not then. But on her next visit, as she wandered through the deep southern wing, her name echoed through the hall, barely above a whisper. Elara. The sound froze her in place. Elara. It came again, softer, more urgent. She turned toward the sound, heart racing, down a narrow hallway lined with ancient books on prophecy and loss. She found an unmarked wooden door. Its surface was worn smooth from years of touch, though no one had seen anyone enter it, and carved into the center, in letters no taller than a breath, was her name. She stepped closer. The air shifted, a heaviness settled on her shoulders, and a single thought rang clear in her mind. Do not enter unless you are ready to be known. But curiosity has always been more powerful than caution. She touched the handle. It was ice cold. The door opened without effort, as if it had been waiting. Inside, the room was perfectly round. Candles floated in the air, flickering with an eerie blue flame. The walls were lined with portraits, but none bore faces. Blank silhouettes stared back at her, each frame marked only with a name. She scanned them quickly, names she didn't recognize. Until she did. Amara Lynn, Thomas Gray, Leona Crest, and then Elara Miles. Her breath caught in her throat. Below her name, the canvas was empty. Her face hadn't been painted yet. Suddenly, the candles flickered wildly. The door slammed shut. In the silence that followed, the voices returned. Not whispers this time, but calls. Elara, do you see now? Elara, you've opened what cannot be closed. Elara, finish what we could not. The portraits began to shift. Images formed faintly. Souls in torment, moments of regret, unfinished stories. She realized they weren't just nameless frames. They were the vanished, people the library had taken, or perhaps people it had tried to preserve. In the center of the room stood a pedestal. Resting atop it was a book bound in dark velvet. Her hands moved on their own as she opened it. Pages turned rapidly, as if alive, until they stopped on a blank one. Her name etched itself in glowing ink. The page began to write. She stepped into room 13, unaware that her choice would ripple through every soul the library ever held. Elara shut the book and turned to leave. The door opened for her again, but now she knew what it was. Room 13 didn't just know her name. It had always been waiting to write her story. Chapter 5, Ink That Cries. The library was quieter than usual the day Elara returned. Not the comforting quiet she'd come to expect, but a stillness so profound it felt like something was holding its breath. Even the air seemed thicker. As she made her way past the towering shelves, she felt the pull, not from a voice this time, but from something deeper, a sadness. She followed it instinctively, winding past volumes older than her great-grandparents, past shelves where no footprints dusted the floor. There, in a forgotten alcove tucked behind a tapestry of a weeping willow, she found him. The old man sat at a crooked desk beneath a flickering lantern. He wore a librarian's robe that looked as if it had once been beautiful, midnight blue with gold trim, but now was threadbare and stained. His eyes, however, were sharp, impossibly blue, and fixed on a book before him. But he wasn't reading. He was crying. Not tears from his eyes, though they shimmered, but tears that dripped directly from the book in front of him. The ink bled slowly from the pages, pooling onto the desk like dark water. It wasn't red like blood. It was darker, sadder, as though grief itself had been liquefied. "You found me," he said without looking up. "The girl the shelves speak of." Elara hesitated. "What's wrong with the book?" He turned a page, and more ink spilled. "These are the volumes of sorrow, written in weeping ink. Each tear is a soul." She stepped closer. The pages trembled at her presence. The words, blurred and running, seemed to reform for a moment, just long enough for her to read a line. He begged to be remembered, but no one would listen. "They write themselves," the librarian said. "When someone is forgotten, truly forgotten, their final thoughts become trapped. Their grief pours into the page." Elara reached for the book, but he placed a shaking hand on hers. "You must not touch them unless you're willing to carry them." She looked into his eyes. There was something breaking inside him, something that had cracked long ago. "Have you read them all?" He nodded once, slowly, "and I remember each name, each face, each moment." "Why do you do it?" "Because someone must." He pushed a different book toward her. This one was closed, but tears still seeped from the spine. "This one's new. It hasn't finished yet." Elara felt a chill as she placed her hands on it. A voice whispered from inside, "Please, not darkness again." She opened it. Images flooded her mind. A girl trapped in a fire. No one believed she had been in the building. Her name was struck from the records. Her family moved on. Only the flames remembered. When Elara opened her eyes again, the librarian was watching her carefully. "You heard her," he said. "Yes," Elara whispered. "I did." He nodded solemnly. "Then it's yours now." As she turned to leave, the book clutched to her chest. The librarian said one last thing. "We are not keepers of stories, Elara. We are the ones who choose to feel them." And as she walked away, the ink still wept, but now not alone. Chapter 6. The Boy Who Never Left. They called him Milo, though few remembered his name. He had walked into the library one cold autumn day decades ago wearing a green woolen coat too big for his frame and shoes that squeaked on the tiled floor. The logbook noted his arrival, but never his departure, and for years his name faded into myth, a child swallowed by the shelves. Elara had heard the tale in whispers, half believed by the town's oldest residents, but the library never forgets. And on one peculiar afternoon, as she wandered through a stairwell she didn't remember being there before, she saw him. He stood at the far end of a hallway, pale and barefoot, his coat now a tattered memory hanging from his thin frame. His eyes were wide with wonder and fear, staring at her, like she had just stepped out of a dream he'd long forgotten. "Are you Milo?" Elara asked. He didn't speak, but turned and ran. Compelled by instinct, she followed. Through narrow aisles and spiral staircases that hadn't existed minutes before, the walls groaned, the lights flickered. She could hear the sound of his footsteps, soft but hurried. Finally, she reached a small room at the top of a spiral tower. The boy stood in the center, surrounded by floating books. They circled him like moths to flame. He looked at her with eyes full of sorrow. "I didn't mean to stay," he said, voice barely audible. "I was looking for a book about stars." Elara stepped closer. "Why didn't you leave?" He shook his head. "The library knew I was lonely. It showed me worlds I never wanted to leave. But then the doors disappeared. My name faded. No one came looking." The books around him pulsed with light. One dropped at Elara's feet. She picked it up and opened it. Inside, she found pages written in a child's handwriting. Drawings of constellations, poems about space, questions about love and loss. "This is your story," she whispered. He nodded slowly. "I kept writing so I wouldn't be forgotten. But now I'm fading." Elara held out her hand. "Come with me. It's not too late." Milo hesitated, then placed his hand in hers. The room trembled. The books slowly returned to their shelves. As they walked down the staircase together, Elara felt a warmth bloom in her chest. When they reached the main floor, Milo began to glow, faintly, like the last light of dusk. "Thank you," he said. "Now they'll remember me." And with that, he faded into the air, leaving only the book in her hand. Inside, a final page had appeared. He was found, and that made all the difference. Chapter 7: The Binding Spell. There were thousands of books in the library, some heavy with dust and silence, others humming faintly like they had breath of their own. But only one sat alone, on a pedestal in the middle of an empty room, bathed in golden light that didn't come from any source Elara could see. The room had no windows, no lanterns, no fire, just the book and the hum. Elara entered slowly, the sound of her footsteps muffled as though the very walls were listening. The pedestal was carved with unfamiliar runes, the language dancing slightly if she stared too long. The book on top was closed, bound in faded burgundy leather, and sealed with a black ribbon that shimmered unnaturally, like a snake shifting beneath the surface. A whisper rose from the ribbon itself. "Do not unbind what you cannot bear to carry." But Elara was already reaching for it. The moment her fingers touched the ribbon, a jolt ran up her arm. Visions flooded her mind, of people trapped in stories they hadn't written, pages that folded over their mouths, ink that poured from their eyes. She saw a child reading aloud, only to fall silent mid-sentence, their voice caught forever between two pages. She stepped back, gasping. From behind her came the soft rustle of robes. The old librarian stood there again. Not the weeping one, but a different figure she had never met before. His eyes were blind, clouded with milky white, but his voice was clear and firm. "That book is sealed for a reason." "What's inside?" Elara asked. "Not what, who," he said. "A spellbinder. The first one. She tried to write her pain into the world, and the world tried to shut her away." Elara looked back at the book, and now? "She waits," the librarian said, "for someone to finish what she started, or undo it." Elara stepped closer again, her fingers trembling as they brushed the ribbon. This time, the ribbon didn't resist. It slithered away, dissolving into shadow. The book opened on its own. Ink spilled upward from the pages, forming symbols that hovered in the air, runes that burned themselves into her memory. A voice, soft but layered with thousands of echoes, filled the room. "To bind a soul is to share its weight." Elara couldn't look away. The symbols circled her now, faster and faster. She felt her body begin to rise, the room pulsing with ancient magic. Then, everything stopped. The book snapped shut. She collapsed to the ground, panting, her hands glowing faintly with golden ink. The librarian knelt beside her. "You are marked now," he whispered. "You've opened the binding. The spell is unfinished, and it will look for you." He helped her to her feet and placed the book in her arms. "Keep it safe, or everything within it will be set free." As she stepped out of the room, the book pulsed gently in her arms, alive, aware, and watching. Chapter 8. Ghosts in the Index. The library had always been full of strange things, but the index room was stranger still. It was supposed to be the most mundane part of the library, just drawers filled with cards, titles, subjects, authors, and dusty records of where each book could be found. But Elara had long since learned that nothing in this place behaved the way it was supposed to. That day, she wandered into the room absent-mindedly, hoping to find something, anything, that might explain the golden ink now tracing strange symbols along her wrists. But as she stepped in, the overhead lights buzzed, then dimmed. The card drawers began to rattle softly, and one opened. A single card slid out halfway. Then another drawer opened, and another. Soon, dozens of cards began to slide out, not chaotically, but deliberately, like fingers reaching for her. The room smelled faintly of smoke and parchment. The air grew colder. She stepped forward and pulled the first card free. It was old, water-stained, and written in faded script. Eliza Tremble, Section Re-23, missing since 1894, last checked out, The Anatomy of Shadows. Another card. Jonas Reed, Section B4, last seen whispering to the walls. Each card wasn't just a catalog entry, it was a record of a person, a soul, a seeker who had once entered the library and never truly left. As she touched them, Elara felt small memories slip into her mind. Eliza's trembling hands, Jonah's quiet humming, a little girl who sang lullabies to forgotten books. All of them lost, but remembered here in the index. The drawers began to move faster now, sliding open and shut like the pulse of a great machine. And from the center of the room, the oldest card drawer creaked open slowly. A single card floated out, suspended midair. It drifted toward her. This one was different. Her name was on it. Elara Miles. Status active. Role witness. Bound to memory. Thread 13. She stared at it, stunned. The card glowed faintly, then burst into soft white light. The light filled the room, and in that moment she saw them. Dozens of ghostly figures standing between the drawers, translucent and watchful. Some looked curious, some looked sad, but none of them looked angry. They began to whisper, not in fear or warning, but in welcome. You see us, you know us, you remember. And Elara whispered back, I won't forget. The cards began to slide back into place. The lights brightened, the figures faded, but not completely. They lingered like candle smoke. As she left the room, Elara held one card tight in her hand. It didn't belong to her, but she was going to find out whose it was, because the ghosts in the index had waited long enough. Chapter 9, where the forgotten wait. The air grew colder as Elara ventured deeper into the library's most obscure corridor. A wing so old it didn't appear on any map, its entrance half covered by a crumbling wall of books. It felt like the architecture itself was trying to forget the place. A narrow archway opened into an impossibly long hall, lined with towering shelves covered in dust thick enough to muffle footsteps. The carpet was threadbare, patterned with strange, swirling designs that almost seemed to move when she wasn't looking directly at them. A distant ticking echoed from nowhere, like a forgotten clock measuring moments no longer tied to time. As she walked, the silence grew heavier. These shelves held no whispering voices, no pulsing energy. They felt dormant, but not dead. The books here didn't hum. They waited. At the end of the hall stood a rusted gate with a sign barely legible beneath layers of grime. The Forgotten Wing. Elara reached out, and the gate creaked open without resistance. A wave of chilled air spilled out. Inside, everything was still, so still it felt wrong. Rows upon rows of books stretched into darkness. But these weren't normal books. Their covers were blank, their pages empty, at least to anyone else. But as Elara stepped forward, the pages began to stir. The first book she touched opened itself. Ink bloomed across the page like a flower in reverse, forming a name. Dorian Vale, a boy who vanished while writing letters no one ever answered. As she turned the next page, his story unfolded, lonely, heartbreaking, unfinished. And then she saw something new. Her own handwriting. It had appeared beside Dorian's, a single line beneath his final entry. You are remembered now. Elara gasped and closed the book. The air shifted again. Another book opened, and another, dozens, all waiting to be seen, to be finished. The stories within these books weren't just forgotten. They had been erased from the memory of the world. Some were tragic, some terrifying, some so mundane they hurt more because of how ordinary their loss had been. A voice spoke from behind a shelf, low and filled with rust. "You found them." An old woman stepped into view. Her skin was pale, nearly translucent, like old parchment. She wore a librarian's robes, faded beyond recognition. "They were never lost," she said, "only waiting for someone to remember they were here." Elara stared at her. "Who are you?" "I am the keeper of the forgotten, the one who guards what the world no longer sees. And you, child, are the one who can make them seen again." Elara looked around, her eyes landing on hundreds of unopened books. The gate behind her remained open, but she knew now she couldn't leave without taking one with her. A single volume hovered into the air and floated toward her. She took it without hesitation, and as she turned to leave, the keeper whispered, "The forgotten remember kindness, and they repay it." Chapter 10. The Archivist's Warning. There were rooms in the library that whispered, others sighed, some cried, but one room did none of those things. It simply waited. It was the archive, hidden beneath the main building in a catacomb of stone, accessed only through a spiral staircase that appeared once a year, or, in Elara's case, when the library willed it so. The staircase was narrow and coiled tightly, lit by floating lanterns that flickered not with fire, but with captured memories. As Elara descended, the air grew colder and the light dimmer, until finally she arrived at a door of blackened oak, with a single word carved in silver. The room inside was vast, impossibly so. Row after row of towering ledgers, scrolls, maps, and tomes stretched into a dim horizon. Time had no place here, nor did noise. In the center sat the archivist. He was ancient, perhaps the most ancient being Elara had ever seen. His skin was papery, the color of old parchment, and his beard trailed down like cobwebs. His eyes were deep-set and luminous, like stars glimpsed through fog. Around him floated scrolls that moved of their own accord, unrolling and rolling endlessly. He didn't look up as she approached. "You're late," he said. "I wasn't invited," Elara replied. "Everyone is," he murmured. Eventually, one scroll floated toward her, its script moving like water. She tried to read it, but the words shifted before her eyes. "You carry the binding," he said. "The mark. The spell is waking and the library is listening more closely now." But me too. "No one ever does," he interrupted, fixing her with a gaze that pierced through memory. "But choices have been made, threads pulled. You've started something, girl, and not even I know how it ends." Elara stepped back. "Then tell me how to stop it." The archivist shook his head. "You don't stop stories, you finish them, or they finish you." He stood slowly, with effort, as though the act itself rewrote history. From beneath his desk, he pulled a thick volume wrapped in chains. "This book contains the endings," he whispered. "But be warned, Reading them may ensure they come true." He placed the book in her hands. It felt colder than ice. "You must choose wisely," he said, "because once a story is remembered, it never goes quiet again." And with that, the room began to darken. The scrolls rolled up, the lanterns dimmed, and the staircase reappeared, glowing faintly with urgency. As Elara climbed back toward the library above, she clutched the chained book to her chest, the archivist's final words ringing in her ears. "Do not open it unless you are ready to see yourself on the last page. The archivist has seen too much, and his warning may be the only thing keeping the library from consuming you." Chapter 11. Dust and Regret. The upper levels of the library were rarely explored, not because they were forbidden, but because they were forgotten. Dust blanketed everything like snow, soft and silent, muffling the passage of time. Elara climbed the old spiral staircase, the iron railing cold and trembling beneath her grip. Each step creaked under her weight, as though complaining about being disturbed after years of quiet. She entered a room at the top, where the shelves curved inward like ribs, enclosing her in a hollow chest of wood and memory. The air was thick with the smell of age, dust, parchment, and something faintly metallic. Cobwebs shimmered like lace in the corners. The light was dim and gray, filtering in through a broken stained glass window. At the center of the room sat a table buried beneath a layer of dust so thick it looked like ash. Elara hesitated before brushing it away. Beneath the dust was a single book. Unlike the others, its title was visible, burned into the cover with a heavy hand. The Record of Regrets. She opened it. Immediately the room changed. The dust in the air shifted, whirling into strange shapes, faces, scenes, fragments of voices. The book's pages turned themselves, revealing entry after entry, written in different hands. I should have told her I loved her. I wish I had stayed instead of running. If only I'd opened the door 1 second earlier. Each sentence hit Elara like a stone to the chest. The sorrow in them wasn't dramatic. It was quiet, personal, raw. These were not the regrets of villains or heroes. They were the regrets of ordinary people, forgotten people. People who had passed through the library and left something behind. She turned another page and froze. Her name was there, Elara Miles. Below it, only one line: "I should have never come back." Her heart pounded. The letters began to fade and reappear, flickering like dying light. A voice whispered behind her, "Regret is a heavy thing." She spun around. A man stood in the doorway, tall and gray-eyed, dressed in a black suit flecked with ash. He looked as though he had stepped out of the dust itself. "Who are you?" Elara asked. "The Regret Keeper," he said. "I collect what others wish undone." "Why am I in the book?" "Because you've seen too much," he said softly, "and because the deeper you go, the more you leave behind." He stepped closer. "Regret isn't about what you did. It's about what you could have done. And the library remembers it all." Elara looked down. Her name was gone now. The page was blank. "But I haven't done anything wrong," she whispered. "Not yet," he replied, "but be careful, Elara. The dust clings hardest to those who think they walk clean." And with that the man vanished, crumbling into ash. The room stilled. The dust settled. Elara closed the book gently, and she didn't know what choice she had made or was about to make that would fill her with such regret. But now she was certain of one thing. The library didn't just remember stories. It remembered consequences. Every speck of dust tells a tale of regret, and one particular layer hides a story best left buried. Chapter 12. The Book That Writes Back. It started with a whisper, faint, familiar, and very much alive. Elara had grown used to strange encounters in the library, but what she found that evening disturbed her in a way that nothing else had. The room was round, lit by a single oil lamp with no windows and a single table at the center. On it sat a book, bound in leather that shimmered like liquid shadow. The cover was blank, but the book pulsed gently, as if breathing. Curiosity drew her closer. The moment her hand hovered above it, her name appeared on the cover. Elara Miles. She yanked her hand back. The name faded. When she reached again, it returned. She opened the book. The first few pages were empty. Then, words began to appear, not inked, but burned gently into the parchment by unseen hands. She enters the room slowly, her heart racing, unsure if she is reading the book or if the book is reading her. Elara froze. She flipped ahead. More words formed before her eyes. She skips ahead, searching for a clue, unaware that the pages she turns were waiting for her fingers alone. It was impossible. The book was alive, conscious. It knew her thoughts, her fears. As if to confirm, the next line read, "Yes, even the ones she keeps buried." A shiver ran down her spine. She closed the book, but it wouldn't stay shut. The pages fluttered open on their own, landing on a new chapter titled simply, "The Choice." There were 2 paragraphs. One ended in fire, the other in silence. She blinked, and they vanished. In their place, 2 blank lines appeared beneath a question. "What story will you write, Elara?" In the room's stillness, she heard a sound. Not her own breath, not the creak of the walls. A heartbeat. The book's heart. And then, slowly, her hand moved on its own. The pen beside the book lifted into the air and placed itself in her fingers. Elara stared at the page. Her thoughts swirled. Was this destiny or a trap? She began to write. She chose to remember, even when it hurt. The book pulsed warmly, and for the first time, it did not write back, because now it had been answered. What if the story you read began to include your name, your thoughts, your deepest fears? Chapter 13. The Night the Library Bled. The rain outside came in waves that night, hammering the stained glass windows with furious rhythm. Lightning flashed like shattered bones across the sky. Inside the library, everything was still. Too still. Elara felt it the moment she stepped through the doors. The air had changed. It was heavier, as if soaked in something ancient and angry. The walls trembled softly, as though bracing for what was to come. Somewhere, deep within the shelves, a low hum had begun to rise, a sound that didn't belong to any machine, any whisper, or even any soul. It belonged to pain. She followed it instinctively. Her footsteps echoed in ways they never had before, the sound sharp and unnatural. Every book she passed seemed to flinch. The air was filled with a metallic scent that grew stronger the farther she walked. Then she saw it. A crack along the spine of one of the main support shelves. Blood, not ink, slowly seeped from between the wooden boards. Deep, dark red. It oozed down the shelves, dripping onto the marble floor with soft, wet splashes. The books began to shake. Elara. The voices were everywhere, layered, distorted. They screamed and sobbed and begged. Elara, it's time. Elara, let us out. Elara, don't look away. She spun in circles. All around her the shelves were bleeding. Crimson tears ran like veins through the walls. The lights flickered, then died. She lit her flashlight, and even its beam struggled to pierce the thickening darkness. The library wasn't just wounded, it was alive, and it was in agony. She stumbled into the central reading hall, and there, standing beneath the grand chandelier, was the chained book the archivist had warned her about. It glowed faintly, pulsing with eerie red light. The chains were broken. The book lay open, and the words on the page bled across the parchment, twisting into grotesque shapes. Elara. The library itself groaned. The walls shifted, shelves cracked, the building shook, and then the souls appeared. Not fully formed, not yet. They were blurs, shadows, bleeding silhouettes crawling from the pages of their books, dragging their stories behind them like chains. Some screamed, some wept. Some reached toward her with hollow eyes. You opened the door, one hissed. Now we all must pass through. Elara fell to her knees, the floor slick beneath her palms. She looked down. Her hands were stained with red, but not her blood. Then a memory. A voice from the mirror. The silence isn't empty. It's full of them. This was what they had warned her about. This was what it meant to carry memory. The spell she had unbound in the binding room wasn't just waking, it was unraveling. She stood, clutched the mirror shard, the key, and the card she still carried. And then she whispered, I see you. I remember you. You are not forgotten. The bleeding slowed. The shadows paused. A single soul stepped forward, a girl with hollow eyes and a broken voice. She reached out and touched Elara's cheek and whispered, thank you. The blood receded. The shelves groaned and grew still. The night the library bled would never be forgotten, because Elara chose not to run. She chose to stay, to witness, to heal. Chapter 14. The final checkout. The library had always been a place of arrivals, of stories beginning, of voices being heard for the first time. But very few spoke of leaving. No one talked about the checkout desk tucked in the back, beneath a rusted sign that simply read, Exit. Elara had passed it dozens of times, never once seeing anyone there. No patrons, no librarians, no stamped cards or quiet farewells. But tonight, the desk was lit. A single lamp cast a golden glow over its surface. A bell rested beside an open ledger, pages crisp and untouched. Behind the desk stood a figure dressed in black and gray, not quite young and not quite old. Their face was oddly forgettable, like a name you once knew but couldn't recall. "You've come far," they said. Elara stepped closer, holding the chain-bound book, the mirror shard, and the key. "Is this the end?" she asked. The figure smiled sadly. "This is the moment before the end. The final page waits. But first, the choice." The ledger flipped open. On the left page, names crossed out, one after another. On the right, a blank line. "You've carried stories that weren't yours. You've remembered the forgotten. You've unbound what should have stayed locked. So now, you choose. Stay and become part of the library, or leave and let go of all you've seen." Elara's hands trembled. The weight of memory pressed down on her. She thought of Milo, of the girl in the mirror, of the book that cried, of the ones still waiting to be remembered. "If I stay," she asked, "you'll become the next librarian, the one who listens, who witnesses, who never leaves. And if I go, they'll fade again. The stories will sleep, and you'll forget." She looked at the pen offered to her. Elara picked it up, and on the blank line she wrote, "I remember." The desk shimmered, the shadows around her shifted. She didn't leave the library that night. Because some stories don't end. They become part of the ones brave enough to carry them. As she stood in the glow of the library's dimming light, a voice echoed from the shelves, softer than ever before. "Elara, welcome home." Chapter 15. The Soul That Remembered. The library was still. Not silent, not empty, but still, like the pause before a breath, the hush before a truth is spoken aloud. Elara stood alone in the center of the atrium, the mirror shard glowing in her hand, the chain-bound book pressed to her chest, and the memory key tucked into her pocket like a heartbeat she couldn't quite quiet. She had chosen to stay, to become the one who remembers. And now, the library had one final truth to show her. The shelves shifted slowly, like great beasts rolling in their sleep. A narrow passage opened between the oldest sections, aisles untouched by dust, where the air shimmered like heat over stone. Elara stepped through, drawn forward by a feeling she couldn't name but had always known. At the end of the passage stood a single reading table, illuminated by a pool of golden light. Seated there was a woman, her back straight, her hair long and silver, her hands folded atop a closed book. Her eyes met Elara's with calm recognition. "You've come," the woman said. "At last." "Who are you?" Elara asked, though her voice caught in her throat. "I am the soul that remembered," the woman replied. "The first. The one who saw what the library truly was and chose to remember it, even as it broke me." Elara stepped closer. "Why me?" "Because you listened. You didn't turn away. You opened doors others feared to touch. And because you carry what others could not bear." The woman gestured to the chair across from her. Elara sat. The library was never built to trap souls, the woman continued. It was meant to protect them, to preserve what would otherwise vanish, but over time it began to forget why it existed. It needed someone to remind it. She placed her hand on the book in front of her. "This is my story," she said, "but it was never finished, because I waited for someone like you." Elara reached out and opened the book. The pages were filled with glowing ink. Her handwriting and the woman's intertwined like threads in a tapestry. Their memories had already begun to merge. As Elara turned the final page, the woman began to fade, not with fear, but with peace. "You've remembered me," she whispered, "and that is enough." With a soft shimmer, she disappeared, leaving only the book behind. Elara stood. She placed the book beside the others she'd collected. The book of regrets, the weeping ink, the binding spell. Together they formed a new shelf, a shelf for the remembered. And as she turned to leave, the lights above flickered softly like stars winking to life in an old familiar sky. Somewhere deep in the library, a voice whispered, "She remembers."